over to him. Dr. Abramson, please.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I appreciate the introduction. I just realized I had forgotten to think of an opening joke in time now. Oh my gosh, do I have an opening joke? Yes, I do. Okay, here's the opening joke. And it's also very historical in nature. So this yeshiva guy, he's got a big family and he has to buy another jalopy to schlep his kids around, and he doesn't have very much money. So he goes to a local dealership, and all the prices are so high he can't possibly afford any vehicle. So the car salesman comes in and says, "What are you looking for?" He says, "Well, I'd really like something that can hold a lot of kids and not cost a lot of money." He says, "I know exactly what you need. I got it for you over here in the lot." Takes him over to the side of the lot, shows him an old beat up Ford Country Squire station wagon, with the full wood panels on the side and a big V8 engine underneath. And he says, "The price is right for you. Have a seat. Try it out." Gets into the car. He says, "Well, it seems really comfortable and it would hold all the kids and stuff like that, but I'm a little concerned because there are no pedals for this car. There's no gas pedal. There's no brake pedal. How do I drive it?" So the guy says, "Well, the truth is this Ford Country Squire wagon was once owned by a very holy Hasidic rabbi, and he blessed it. And the way you make it go is you use the traditional greeting and phrase, Baruch Hashem, right? Blessed is God. That, you can use in all kinds of contexts. Baruch Hashem will make the car go." He says, "Oh, that's fantastic. How nice. And how about to slow it down, to stop it?" He says, "Well, you simply say, Shema Yisrael, right? Another prayer, Hear, O Israel. And with these two basic phrases, you will be able to drive the car and you can afford it." So he says, "That's great." He takes the car, he buys it. He's driving off the lot. Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem. He's driving along. The car is going fantastic. He's thinking about how he's going to show it to his family and everyone's going to be so surprised. He got a beautiful car for a great deal. And then he suddenly realizes that he forgot which phrase slows down the car. And the car is speeding up and he's losing control and he's racking his memory, trying to remember, what did he say? What was the phrase? He's trying Hamotzi Lechem in Haaretz. He's trying every single phrase he can think of. He can't get the car to slow down. Finally, he goes down the wrong way of a one-way street and he's honking the horn, get people out of the way, and he breaks through a barrier of a construction site, goes up on a freeway up ramp, and he realizes it's under construction, and momentarily he is going to go off the edge and his life will be at an end. So like good religious Jew, he realizes, it's incumbent upon a Jew when his life is, God forbid, after 120 about to end, that he should pronounce the great statement of the unification of God's identity. He covers his eye and he says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And the car stops right at the edge of the exit ramp. Takes his hand off his eyes and says, "Oh, Baruch Hashem." Right? I can sort of see that people are laughing a little bit tonight. So sometimes today's class in particular is going to feel a lot like there's some Shema Yisraels and some Baruch Hashems, and then a few more Shema Yisraels. It's going to be like that throughout. So let me take you to my screen and we'll begin this class. Oy vey, Smir. Is it sharing properly? I'm not sure if it's sharing properly here. What do you see? Do you see the under Crescent and Gross screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So our task for today is basically to cover the medieval period. And for our purposes, I'm going to define that basically from the era of the writing of the Talmud, which is codified and closed around the year 500, and take it all the way up to the Spanish expulsion. Well, I'm not going to speak about the expulsion too much today because it's a complicated topic and it deserves a little more space. So we'll leave that for our fourth lecture, but we're basically going to cover 1,000 years from about the year 500 to about the year 1500, the entirety of the medieval period. There's a lot of discussion as to what do you mean by medieval anyways. We are more or less adopting a Christian way of dividing time. Most European, especially Christian historians, kind of look at history, and this is a very traditional approach from the 18th century onward, is that there's kind of like this high point in the classical world with the Greeks, with Plato and Sophocles and Socrates and Aristotle, and then you hit the sack of Rome, which is going to be part of our talk today. It drops way down into the Dark Ages, and then when you get to the high Middle Ages, like the year around 1000, 1100, 1200, you start to wake up and you have the Renaissance, right? The rebirth. So according to the way Christian historiography worked in the 18th century, is that history has a big valley in the middle of it, and that middle period is called medieval, or between the ages, between the high point of the Greeks and the high point of the Renaissance. You have the Dark Ages in the middle. So it doesn't really make sense for Jews, because when everyone else was dealing with the Dark Ages, we were writing the Talmud, and we were developing responsa literature, and we were writing amazing poetry that we're still using today at our Shabbos tables, and all kinds of fantastic creative literary efforts. So we didn't have a Dark Ages in the same way, but nevertheless, we're going to borrow that rough chronology, because we do have major chunks of time that correlate to our diaspora experience. This big 1,000 years represents a great comparative period where we were either under Crescent, meaning under the Muslim rule in Muslim countries, where we were more or less the only minority. I just realized that I feel like I'm speaking to Unsura here, to our own people, because I just gave an academic lecture a few minutes ago, an hour ago, and I would always speak of the Jews in the third person, and all of a sudden it's first person, because we're in family here. So pardon my departure from standard academic lingo. I hope you'll forgive me, but I'll stick probably with the first person. It's late at night. So we were doing great things during the Dark Ages. We didn't really have a Dark Ages in the same way, but we're going to use that same terminology. So let's start at the beginning of this period, which is the end of antiquity, meaning the end of the ancient period. The Christian world, Christian historiography, dates antiquity basically from the 5th century. When Rome was sacked, right? The glory that was Rome, that represents the end of this great ancient period that extends from the pre-Socratics all the way through Christianity and the greatness that was Rome, until it's finally attacked by several groups of Germanic tribes, including, by the way, the Vandals. We name our, artistic in leaning criminals as Vandals after them, and they sack Rome. Now, I will share with you that when I used to teach World Civilization 1 as a required course to the big audiences of undergraduates at Florida Atlantic University, I used to say the Vandals sacked Rome and they took booty. And then that was fine for a few years, but after a while, students started, snickering. And finally, someone came up to me, a very kind student, said, "By the way, professor, you shouldn't say take booty anymore, because words change meaning, and it doesn't mean the same thing it did when I went to undergraduate school." I hope you're finding this enjoyable. I'm laughing thinking about it, but it's hard to tell on Zoom whether you're enjoying it. At any rate, they took spoils is better than saying taking booty. But they came, and as you can see in this Burulov print, they also apparently took the treasures of the temple that had been stored in Rome in the temple of Zeus. So that's the end of Rome, and Europe kind of descends into this period of obscurantism and barbarism known as the Dark Ages. Now, that's not the end, however, of Roman culture. It basically takes a big step to the right, and Constantinople, which is located where the little red tag is there. Today, of course, the city is called Istanbul, inherits Rome. It becomes called the Nova Roma, the New Rome, because Christianity is essentially now headquartered in Constantinople. And this will contribute to the ultimate schism. It would take another 500-600 years for it to really develop between the Eastern Orthodox Christians and the Roman Catholics, because Rome will, of course, rise up once again. But the reason why this is especially significant for us is because the Jews who primarily live in Israel at this time will be underneath the Byzantine Romans. By the way, it's also called Byzantium because the original name of the town was Byzantium. Then it was named Constantinople after the emperor who founded it as a Christian capital. And later, when the Muslims took it over, it would be called Istanbul. So what's going on in Israel at this time under Constantinople? We'll discuss that in the next set of slides when we look at early Christianity. The real action in the Jewish world is really happening in Baghdad. As you can see here, the tremendous influence of Baghdad throughout the Jewish diaspora. There is a significant population of Jews living in Israel itself. Contrary to popular opinion, there was always a consistent population in Israel from ancient times. It was sometimes really, really small. For example, when the great scholar Nachmanides was forced to flee Spain in the 13th century and made his way to Jerusalem, he found that they did not even have a minyan in Jerusalem for Yom Kippur. They had to bring in scattered Jews from the countryside just to make a minyan for Yom Kippur. And he, in his old age, rose up like a lion and was able to revive that community almost single-handedly in the 13th century. Really remarkable end-of-life story for a Torah giant. At any rate, there was, at this point, if we're talking about the year 500, still a significant population of Jews living in Israel, but they were slowly losing their primacy, meaning the beating heart of the Jewish world had shifted to Mesopotamia, to the great Talmudic academies that existed between the two great rivers. You can see them there. Baghdad is on the bank of the Tigris River, and to the south is the Euphrates River. And in that region, you had the great yeshivas of Sura and Pumbedita and Harda and others. When Baghdad became a Muslim capital, ultimately the great yeshivas migrated to that city. And from there, they issued a commanding voice, helping to centralize Jewish practice, Jewish worship, Jewish ideas in areas which were in sometimes extremely pragmatic, like, for example, the calculation of the leap month, which is a hugely contested thing in the ancient world. One of the major ongoing disputes for several hundred years was whether or not the authorities in Jerusalem had the right to proclaim a new month, or as some of the Gaonim, like Saadia Gaon, one of the great thinkers of Baghdad, whether it should come from Baghdad instead. Ultimately, Saadia Gaon and Baghdad won that out. I'm sure you're familiar that in the Jewish calendar, in order for it to be a lunar calendar, which follows the phases of the moon. That's why Rosh Chodesh is always with a new moon. The 15th of the month, as we're coming up to with Passover, is always going to be a full moon in the Hebrew calendar. In order to make that fit with a solar year, which is short by about 11 days, I think it's 6 times in 19 years, they have to insert a leap month, like we just had with the second month of Adar. So figuring out exactly whether or not it's necessary and when to start it is a crucial thing, because if you get it wrong, you have just put Yom Kippur on the wrong day. You have everybody coming to shul for Rosh Hashanah on the wrong day, and they jealously guarded that particular right. At any rate, this is really where the center of Jewish life is happening, is in Baghdad, and they're communicating with far-flung communities all across the coast of North Africa, down into the south in Yemen, where there was a brief-lived Jewish kingdom as well, and all the way out to Spain and the beginnings of the European continent. So the key thing to say about the 1,000 years we're covering is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's basically 2 big populations. Jews living in Muslim lands, like the Jews of Baghdad, and all the way across the Middle East and North Africa into Spain, and the Jews living in Christian lands, which is primarily the Byzantine Empire in Asia Minor, what would be today Turkey, the Greek peninsula, the Italian peninsula, and slowly the coast of the northern Mediterranean, all the way up into the Rhineland. Those are our two big populations that we have to concern with. So I'd like to look first at the experience of the Jews in the Islamic world, and then we're going to look at the experience of the Jews in the Christian world, which is rather radically different. Islam, remarkable spread of this monotheistic faith in the first third of the 7th century. Muhammad comes from Medina, as you can see in the map here, towards the center, lower center of this page. And he is encountering Jews, encountering Christians, and he claims to go out into the desert and bring back a revelation from the angel Gabriel. If that sounds familiar, Gabriel, it's because there's a lot of stuff in Islam that is just borrowed straight from Judaism. It's interesting as well to see the things that were borrowed and then modified. Like, for example, originally, Muhammad wanted everyone to pray facing Jerusalem, like the Jews do. But when the Jews of these regions refused to convert to Islam, he changed his mind and said, no, we're going to pray towards Mecca instead. But they, in many ways, Islam tried to out-Jew the Jews. So Jews pray 3 times a day. Muslims will pray 5 times a day. Ms. Friedman, I forgot. Did I say the joke last time about the first clergyman in outer space? And if I did, do you remember it?
I missed the last one, so I don't know. Someone else has to answer.
Rabbi Enfeld, do you remember it? Because otherwise I'm going to tell his joke.
I don't think you did.
Great,
Okay.
I want to hear it.
Thank you. Now you're stuck. You should have said, yes, we heard it, and then you wouldn't have to go through with it. But it goes like this. So, and I've already given away the premise here for this, right? So the joke goes, first 3 clergymen in outer space. This is actually a clean joke. Don't worry. I try not to tell off-color jokes. First 3 clergymen in outer space. They get up on the space shuttle. They orbit the Earth a few times. They come back down. And the journalists are all crowded around the landing pad, and they all want to hear, what these men of God thought of their experience in outer space. And they asked the Catholic priest, what did you think of your experience? And he says, I thought of the infinity of God's creation. I grasped the hugeness of the universe. And they asked the Protestant minister, and he said, I thought of the tiniest of humanity, how we are just a tiny insignificant speck on the scope of this grand creation. And they asked the rabbi, and the rabbi said, who had time to think? Shachris min chamarav, Shachris min chamarav, right? Because they're going around the earth, right? Oh, you evased me, sorry. My son, who is 17, says, just stop telling jokes, Dad. Just stop. Okay, so Islam, it moves from the Hejaz, which is this region on the coast of the Red Sea there, and with incredible speed, it conquers the Middle East, all of North Africa, makes very significant headway into the Balkans, quite nearly conquers Europe, actually. So can you imagine what history would have been like had the Muslims not lost a few key battles in France, for example, and at the Danube? I mean, it would have been a rather different Europe than we have today. The reasons for the spread are complex. Christian historiography, especially in the 19th century, tended to emphasize this idea that the Muslims threatened that if you did not convert to Islam, they would kill you, and therefore that's why they spread so fast. That theory doesn't hold a lot of weight. It definitely is a contributing factor, and in those occasions where the Muslims did use their military force, it was quite effective. But the reality is that Islam presented for the pagan backdrop of much of these lands a very competitive ideology. It actually represented a colorblind faith, which was quite significant for many areas where there are big slave populations. This will be very significant when it goes out to the east and encounters the regions which would later be Pakistan and Bangladesh, where people are trapped in lower levels of the caste society, and Islam said we don't recognize castes. So it suddenly became a huge possibility for lower caste members to rise socially and economically. So Islam really spreads with remarkable rapidity across the region. It does not succeed, however, in converting the Jews. Jews, by and large, are quite content to retain their ancestral faith, which incensed Muhammad, much like it would Martin Luther 1,000 years later. Both Muhammad and Martin Luther felt that the reason why Jews hadn't converted is because they didn't see anything better. But once they saw Islam, or for Luther, once they saw Protestantism, then they would, in fact, leave their ancestral faith. When that failed to happen, both Muhammad and Martin Luther, became extremely bitter about their originally warm relationship with the Jews. And in the case of Islam, violence ensued. In the case of Luther, he changed his style of writing dramatically. He originally wrote a book called That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew, very warm philo-Semitic work. And later he wrote a book after he realized the Jews were not banging down the doors to his churches to enter, that he wrote a book called The Jews and Their Lies. Right, so big turnaround. All right, what did this mean for the Jews who remained in the Islamic orbit? One of the things that Muhammad recognized was the idea of partial or fragmentary revelation. This notion was that God had attempted to communicate with the world on several occasions through a number of prophets, including, for example, Adam, Abraham, of course, the father of the Arabs as well as the Jews, Moses, Jesus. These are all regarded as prophets within Islam. And Muhammad, however, was the seal of the prophets. And he represented kind of like a fix on the earlier communications. Why did the earlier communications need to be replaced? Primarily because they had been corrupted by their followers. So in other words, according to Islam, the teachings of Jesus were actually Islamic, but his later followers messed things around and changed things up so that they no longer corresponded to Islam. And the same with the Jews. It's kind of like, the software developer created a beautiful product, but it was a little bit buggy, and it was buggy because people kept, downloading things, and it interfered with the operating system. So ultimately, this is the last upgrade. You will never have to upgrade your operating system again. Islam is the ultimate. So that meant that Islam could recognize both Jews and Christians, and technically a few other groups as well, as people of the book, because they had received some type of communication from God. And even though they were unfortunately deceived as to its accuracy, they still were trying to maintain faith with God. And so therefore, Islam, intensely monotheistic faith, said, okay, fine, you can keep your ways as long as you don't interfere with what we're trying to do here. So what does that actually mean in practice? They adopted something which was called the Pact of Umar. It's dated to the 9th century. There's a lot of questions as to whether or not it's actually historically dated to that point, or whether it was written a little bit later, and what elements were added and changed. But this was essentially an agreement between Umar, who is the Caliph, the highest authority in Islam, and the minorities who were either Jewish or Christian, as to what their rights and responsibilities and privileges were. And this turned out to be actually something that Jews really enjoyed, even though they were mildly discriminatory, because historically speaking, that is the most fecund society for Jews to flourish in. Meaning, historically speaking, Jews certainly don't do well in highly discriminatory environments. That's when Jews are persecuted and God forbid harmed, and the Jews have to run away or rebel if they can. So that's not an ideal environment. Jews also do not do very well in extremely liberal environments where there are so few kind of like external pressures keeping them together as a community, that assimilation becomes a very dramatic challenge. We are living in one of those times right now where, you just look at the agenda of any federation meeting, reading between the lines, one thing we're always worried about is where are all the Jews going, and how do we keep our numbers together, and how do we keep people interested in Judaism, because it's so easy to simply step over the walls and join secular society. So mildly discriminatory environments where Jews always feel like they're just a little bit persecuted and they've got to stick together, that turns out to be ones in which Jews tend to succeed. And we can point to, for example, the high development of Jewish civilization in Montreal during the Parti Québécois years. You can look at South Africa before the persecution really got way out of hand, but a little bit more minor persecution. Jews did very well there for much of the 20th century. And you could say this in general about the Pact of Umar. Let's have a closer look at it. So here's the basic parameters. There are religious restrictions on Jewish religious activity, especially reaching beyond their barriers to teach Judaism to non-Jews. And there are like some more inconvenient things, like Jews are not allowed to expand their religion. They're not allowed to build any new shuls. They can keep their old shuls in repair, but they can't build new ones. And by the way, this and all of the other rules were largely ignored. Jews frequently simply bribed local officials, and it was an open secret that Jews could build more synagogues and things like that. The Pact of Umar was rarely enforced. Second, there's some symbolic discrimination and social distinctions, like Jews were not allowed to bear weapons, which was a sign of authority and power. Jews were required to wear certain articles of clothing or colors of clothing, and certain colors of clothing were forbidden to them. And when they were to ride an animal, they could only do it without a saddle, meaning it was like a donkey or something like that. Now, again, these are things which were on the books, but largely ignored for a fee. So Jews did not feel, by and large, in Islamic lands, especially hampered by them. And then thirdly, there were some mildly discriminatory requirements of Jews, which were primarily economic in nature, and that actually was enforced fairly well, that Jews had to pay a special tax called the Jizya, which was essentially a double tax beyond what everyone else had to pay. They were exempt from a charitable tax called the zakat, but nevertheless didn't offset the larger cost of the jizya. But with that payment and with the occasional act of public deference, Jews could basically live their lives pretty much as they wanted to under the Pact of Umar. And we should also bear in mind that besides the actual legal parameters that the Jews lived under here, we should bear in mind that Islam is very different from Christianity in terms of its cultural closeness to Judaism. Christianity, by contrast, is much further away from Judaism, primarily because, Christianity is really focused on creed. What does a person believe? If you accept Jesus as your personal savior, if you are born again, these are like really important things to Christianity. Whereas in Judaism, the truth is you can count on two hands the number of things that you must believe to be Jewish, but we're very concerned about how you behave. Tremendous amount of regulation without any real distinction between ritual law, criminal law, civil law, personal hygiene, how you sleep. All those things are codified, particularly in pre-modern Judaism, before you have the 19th century denominational shifts, which will treat those issues differently. But in traditional Judaism in the medieval period, Muslims and Jews, although they will use different words, they will understand the vocabulary. We have kashrut, they have halal. We both have tzniut. We both have the idea, like you see these women here, modern Jew and Christian and Muslim, both wear head coverings, for example, for married women. They have a charitable tax, which they call zakat. I mentioned a moment ago. We have tzedakah. almost identical word, same kind of idea. So there's a great cultural convergence between Muslims and Jews. And until you get to the 19th century with the very significant political conflict over the future of the land of Israel and the Zionist movement, Jews by and large did much better in Muslim lands than they did in Christian lands. And that's what I'd like to turn to next. But I am at the halfway point. Why don't I pause for a quick look at the chat if there are any questions that we should answer here. LOL, I agree. 7 of every 7 of 19. Thank you for correcting. That's the number of leap years. 7 out of every 19. Does anyone else have any questions or objections, clarifications? Okay, so then I'll dive back in.
Sorry, just 1 second. We do have a question, Shoshana.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I never quite understood why Muslim women never moved to wearing shaitels, wigs, like Jewish women did. Is there any kind of historical kind of foundation for that? I mean, they wouldn't be discriminated so much in our society now, especially, as you know, Professor, that in Quebec, you can't wear religious symbols. So a lot of women who wear the hijab have been kicked out of jobs, government jobs. So why don't they just wear wigs?
So that's an excellent question. It's a little bit outside my area of expertise. I don't really know much about Muslim theology and practice, but I think I could turn the question on its head and say, how come Jews decided a shaitel is okay? And in fact, more religious Sephardi women will not wear shaitels. They consider them, they look too much like real hair. And they say that misses the whole point. A married woman is supposed to show her status by wearing some article of clothing as opposed to, hair or fake hair or whatever. It was the Ashkenazi women who were able to dictate their fashion. Actually, it's quite a fascinating question. I will mention 2 things. First of all, I have one of my daughters. She married a guy whose family is originally from Spain through Venezuela, and she wears a mitpachat, and it's like kind of this fancy turban-y thing that looks really cool. So that's one. That's not relevant. The other thing I wanted to say is it probably has to do, I'm guessing, with the activity that fits with our talk today. About the year 1000, a very important Italian rabbi named Rabbi Gershom Meir Hagola, Rabbi Gershom, the light of the exile, he put in place a lot of really forward-thinking legislation regarding women. He included, for example, the ban on polygamy that Ashkenazic Jews were forced to accept under his authority. He only set a deadline of 500 years, though, so they had to renew it in the year 1500. And in the year 2000, there were actually some people who were saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't renew it again because, polygamy, why not? But the rabbi shouted them down saying, no, we've done it 1,000 years. We're not going to start marrying more than one wife. He put in fact a lot of legislation that sort of normalized Jewish women's practice with Christians' women's practice of the day. And I have a feeling that sort of cultural trajectory, that kind of tropism, probably affected the decision of Ashkenazi women to accept the pe'anochrit, the wig, as opposed to the hijab. That would be my guess. Okay, why don't I get back to the lecture, because we've got to talk about Christianity, and that's actually the bigger part of this lecture, so I will speak super fast. Here we go. Let me know if you can see the screen okay. Where is it here? Here we go.
Can I just suggest that if anyone has any questions from this point forward, that we put them in the chat box only?
Yeah, probably a good idea. Thank you, Rabbi. Okay, so let's talk about the Jews in Christian lands. So there are several things going on. First of all, the church becomes ascendant, right? And don't forget that we're dealing with a daughter religion that we spoke about last lecture that has suddenly come to power over the mother religion. The daughter religion formally becomes a religio licita, a licensed religion in the 4th century. And ultimately, it becomes the religion of the ruling elite and of the entire Byzantine Empire. So it is in this environment that the relationship of this emerging faith, which is now matured to be a state religion, has to look back on its predecessor, Judaism. And that's a complicated kind of look back because, you know, why are the Jews still there? If Christianity, represents a step forward, like a new software release, why are people insisting on not getting the new software? Why are they holding on to that old one? This is a theological problem which will really plague Christianity right up until the 20th century in many ways, because they're struggling with how to theologically justify the presence of Jews. Some of those early church fathers, as they're called, are people like Saint Jean Chrysostom, who was active in Asia Minor. And he was a prime exponent of what was called the Adversus Judaeus literature, in which he spent a lot of time really criticizing the Jews in an attempt to define their relationship with Christianity. In particular, you know, when you read his sermons, you get a sense of what Christians were actually doing. For example, he was really angry that Christians, many of whom, don't forget, are they're not coming from Jewish backgrounds now. They're coming from non-Jewish ethnicities. They're largely illiterate. They're making stuff up as they go along. And if they see the Jews in their neighborhood doing things, and they say, well, okay, we come from them, I guess we should do like them. So they're observing Shabbos on Saturday. And he's saying, no, we switched it already to Sunday. Don't do this. You can't like put your work off to Sunday and rest on Saturday. You got to rest on Sunday like the rest of us Christians. Do not give presents to those Jews on their holidays like Rosh Hashanah, stuff like that. And whatever you do on Easter, don't eat matzah. Yes, I know that Jesus went to a Last Supper. Yes, I know he would have eaten matzah, but we don't, okay? Like Chrysostom was like getting really worked up, trying to make distinctions between his emerging Christian community, which was confused, frankly, about how they were supposed to relate to Jews. And he placed all kinds of restrictions on them. He, in fact, said to them, whatever you do, don't think that going to synagogue is going to cut it with God. You can't go pray in a synagogue. It's forbidden. You pray in a church. They pray in a synagogue, and in fact, I'd rather they not pray in a synagogue either, but that's the deal. And so there was a lot of hostility generated by thinkers like Chrysostom, but it was kind of brought to a theoretical calming point by St. Augustine. It was actually a fascinating thinker. He wrote his book called Confessions, which describes his own personal religious trajectory. But anyway, he thought a lot about the Jews, and to make this long story short, he eventually came up with this idea, which was codified in church thought as the doctrine of witness. And this doctrine actually served to protect Jews for the next 1,500 years. It was only really when St. Augustine's thought declined in Europe, that we get to a more secular age, that genocide is truly possible. That even though there will be persecution of Jews, you will not have an outright attempt to destroy all of them because of Augustine's sort of calming influence. What he basically argued was that, you know what, we have to let the Jews live. We have to slay them not. Those are his words. Because as the original people of Jesus, they have to be here when Jesus returns in order to affirm. That's the sense of witness. They have to say, yes, this is he. Christianity is correct. We were wrong all along. If they were, God forbid, to be all killed, there would be no one who could have the authority and legitimacy as the bearers of that ancient tradition to affirm the second coming. So he mandated the existence of the Jews with this doctrine. And the church was, by and large, pretty good at following it. But notice that it does not require that Jews can be elevated. Jews, in fact, should still be persecuted, kept down, economic challenges, Christians should not look at them and admire them, but they should think of them and how they're cursed because they didn't accept Jesus, but they have to exist in order to serve either purpose. So this doctrine of witness, even though it's kind of nasty in some ways, it also meant that the Jews were preserved by Christianity. So where are Jews living in Europe at this time in Christian lands? One of the most fascinating ways to understand the migration of Jews is through DNA research. And some fascinating results have thrown out some historical models. If you look at this map here, you'll see there's a sort of a hatched green line that's not labeled 5 that goes across the coast of North Africa into Spain and then into Europe. For a long time, many historians believe that's how Jews got to Europe. But with a new DNA research, that model has been discarded. And we now know that the dominant path that Jews took was through the Italian peninsula. You'll recall that in the context of the Roman Jewish wars, there were some tens of thousands of Jews who were taken there in slave ships. There was already a Jewish community existing there beforehand. And DNA experts have identified 4 Italian women from the northern part of the peninsula who account for about 46% of Ashkenazic Jews, meaning we're all related, or half of us almost are related to 4 women who are probably converts to Judaism from northern Italy, and they constitute the primary genetic material that resulted in the development of the Rhineland. They also, of course, Jews from the Rhineland also exhibit lots of markers that they come from the Middle East. So on the father's side in particular, lots of Eastern Europe. Then later the Jews will move to Eastern Europe. The Ashkenazic Jews will move that way. This largely, debunks the rather absurd theory that most Ashkenazi Jews are actually descended from the Khazars, which is an interesting people that lived somewhere north of the Caspian Sea, not too far from Ukraine, just a little bit further to the east, who apparently converted to Judaism in the year 740, as popularized in this book, written 500 years later, not as a historical book, but rather as a philosophical conceit to provide the opportunity for a contrast of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We don't know a lot about what actually happened with the Khazars in the 8th century, but it is unlikely that that conversion reached very deep into society. And when they were defeated by the Kievan Rus and by the Mongols, they largely disappeared. But there are a few fascinating fragments of their existence, such as this document, which showed up in the Cairo Geniza, which I believe we talked about last time we met, which is essentially a tzedakah collector's note. The guy comes from Kiev, he's visiting Cairo, and he's collecting funds. And this note essentially is his letter of introduction, telling people they should contribute to his cause. And fascinatingly, it is signed in Hebrew and by one individual in Turkic runes, indicating that there was some kind of bizarre Jewish Khazar community, but we know very little about it, and it seems to have had very little impact on the rest of the world. At any rate, what's happening in the Rhineland at this point is that the Jews are pioneering a social structure for their municipalities, which borrowed some elements from earlier diaspora communities, but proved to be an extremely reliable method of organizing themselves and providing a tremendous social safety net for everyone. Basically, what they did was they organized their municipalities, a kind of a Jewish self-government, where you were led by the Tuvei Ha'ir, the good people of the city. It was not fully democratic. It was limited to men, and it was limited to men of property, but they would typically form something like a committee of 7 men who would then, from their group, appoint a parnas, which is like a president, and they would hire a rabbi. If you look at this, you're actually looking at the contemporary organization of almost every shul in the United States and Canada as well, because this structural model, although it was not applied to cities after the French Revolution, it was certainly applied to congregations. The parnas and the rabbi are sometimes in kind of a dynamic flux, because if the good people of the city and the parnas want to get away with something that maybe skirts the edge of Jewish law, the rabbi will correct them. But if the rabbi gets out of hand and starts making too many demands of the community, present company excluded, the Parnas and the committee can actually stop paying him and tell him to get a job somewhere else. So it's kind of like a dynamic tension between the demands of the wealthier classes and the demands of religion that are personified by the rabbi. But both groups have access to the Gabayim. Now, I'm sure you have Gabayis in your shul. They are only a shadow of what they were in the medieval period. Today, a Gabbai basically decides who gets an aliyah, when, and who opens the ark and stuff like that. But in the medieval period, they were enforcers. They were the strong men who could make sure, with threat of corporal punishment, that you would follow the dictates of either the Parnas or the rabbi. And then underneath them, well, almost all of these groups are exclusively male. The chevrot, the committees, are dominated by women. And here you have, of course, the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, which would have a men's division as well as the women's division, and all kinds of things. Whatever the community needed, they would pitch in and they would make sure that those needs were met. So very, very resilient kind of organization. It was supported by mandatory taxes, which were assessed by the good people of the city and collected by the Gabayim. So in other words, every year they would say, oh, we see that you've done well in your dairy or in your smithing shop and things like that. This is how much you've got to pay this year. You say, no, it's too much, too bad. The Gabayim would collect it, and then that funding would be used to make sure all these support networks were in place. And when you compare it to what non-Jewish society is doing, it's such an incredibly sophisticated organization that worked tremendously well to preserve the Jewish people at this time. It was coercive. If you didn't like the whatever the rabbi or the Parnas said, you had very few options to rebut it and to object to it. But it meant that Jews really stayed within their boundaries. There were a few exceptional opportunities for protest, like, for example, a woman in particular, if she felt she was not treated well by the Gabbais, she could go to shul and, obviously they're praying men and women in separate areas, and she could enter the men's area and stand on the bima and refuse to allow the synagogue to continue until she gets a promise that her needs will be met. This was a kind of a last-ditch effort, but it would work from time to time. So this is the kind of society that they're setting up, and it's extremely effective. They're also economically deeply involved at this point in money lending. And the reason for this is primarily because the Christians leave open sort of a loophole for the granting of credit in medieval society. The Christians followed a law in Deuteronomy, just as the Jews did, that specifically forbade the charging of interest to one's co-religionist. Jews may not charge interest to Jews. Jews may charge interest to non-Jews, and the same thing for Christians. So until the church eventually decided that it was simply too profitable to miss out on, and they started establishing the Monte di Pieta in Italy, which is essentially kind of like a church-approved credit association, Jews were the only money lenders in Europe and the only ones to really provide credit for developing societies. And it was highly desired. It was especially desired by the king, who could tax the Jews for their activity in money lending. This picture, by the way, is not of a Jewish couple. I happen to like it a lot, but you can see from the wife of the money changer that she's clearly reading. If you look at the image on the book, it's clearly Christian literature, but still, I get the feeling this is what a Jewish couple would have looked like when they were money lending. At any rate, the king loved it because he could tax the Jews. And so in the feudal structure of medieval Europe, he called the Jews servi camerae regis, which means servants of the royal chamber, that they reported directly to the king. And the king was very careful to protect his Jews because of their income producing capability, which was often resented by the church. When the church was ascendant in the 13th century in particular, that's when the Jewish fortunes in particular began to wane. I'm going to skip over this because I'm a little concerned about time. So there's internal pressures going on. There's also external pressures happening. The Crusades begin in late 1095. In 1096, there are some horrible massacres of Jews in northern Germany, because the whole idea of the Crusades was to go down to Jerusalem and to take it away from the Muslims who controlled it. And a lot of less enthusiastic crusaders said, why are we going all the way to Jerusalem to do this? We have infidels living right here in the Rhineland. And so a series of pogroms occurred in 1096 and onward that made Jews feel far less welcome in Western Europe. This is also a period of time when the church is trying to articulate a lot of the theological differences between Judaism and Christianity by portraying them as two women, church and synagogue, with the synagogue clearly portrayed as negative and in decline, or as you can see in the right-hand picture in the stained glass version, rejected by God utterly, with a sword driven into the top of her head, a motif that appears over and over again. And this is also the era of the notorious blood libel, which originates first with a charge that the Jews needed to reenact the crucifixion of Jesus, beginning in 1144 in England, and then many other bizarre QAnon-type details are added, most notoriously that Jews need to drink the blood of an innocent Christian child for a whole host of bizarre reasons. Like, for example, the charge that Jewish men menstruated and they needed to drink the blood to replace their iron loss. Unfortunately, this charge really gripped the medieval imagination, and from the 12th century onward, it just spreads like wildfire through Europe. And in fact, it's hard to get rid of it even today. Here is an example from 2020, if you can believe it. A well-known Italian artist, Giovanni Gasparo, chose to make a notoriously grotesque anti-Semitic reproduction of the martyrdom of Simon of Trent, also one of these blood libel cases, just before the pandemic. Absolutely horrific. Related to this is the charge of host desecration, the charge that Jews would steal the communion wafers, usually with a Christian accomplice, bring it home to their synagogues, where on the right panel you can see they would stab it and it would bleed, and then they would be discovered. In the second panel, they would throw the wafers into the oven, and miraculously a form of a child appears and doves fly out, but then there would be a pogrom afterwards and the people would be set on fire and so on. That part of the story actually did occur. So there's a lot of reasons why Jews are feeling very uncomfortable in Western Europe. The last straw is the Black Death, which races through Europe. And as people are trying to figure out why are we dying of bubonic plague, a rumor goes out that Jews have gone into an agreement with lepers to poison the well springs of Europe. Here you can see a stylized image of a Jew wearing a turban, putting the diseased flesh of a leper into a fountain, and this devilish thing a demon comes spinning out and urinates back into the water, poisoning it. So altogether, you've got a tremendous amount of persecution of Jews going on in the 11th, 12th, 13th century. So many of them elect to move east. And that big movement eastward is going to be extremely important for our understanding of the development of Ashkenazi Jewry, which we'll start into next week. This map here just gives you a sense of the number and scope of expulsions, which were often repeated multiple times. You can see in France, 3 times in the 14th century, Jews are expelled. The reason is because they're expelled because noblemen feel the debt load is too high. Noblemen also borrowed heavily from Jews. And so it's easier to simply expel the people you owe money to than to pay it back. But then once you expel them, because the church doesn't allow Christians to engage in credit, you have to invite them back in order to start the economy again, and then you expel them again. And this happens 3 times in France. It's absolutely absurd. The expulsions are also related to the charge of misanthropy, that Jews engage in these horrible things like the blood libel and so on. And of course, with the Black Death in the 1300s, that was kind of like the last straw, and you have lots of Jews moving to Poland. So where I'm going to end off for tonight is just to have a very quick look at the Spanish exception because Spain doesn't fit any of the models that we've discussed here. This is a remarkable page from the Sarajevo Haggadah, which turned up in Sarajevo, was originally written in Spain in the 14th century. And one of the most fascinating elements is a mystery. You'll see this is a woman's Seder table. It looks like the head of the household is on the right with the largest cup. And then there are several women engaged in various parts of the meal, also with a little cup, a child there. And then on the bottom left, there is a strange dark-skinned woman. Her skin looks purple here. That's primarily because of the way the pigment has aged. It would have been brown in the original. So some scholars have opined that this must be a servant of the family, but she looks like she's fully participating with she's holding up, it looks like a goblet there. So she's also drinking the 4 cups. She is dressed similarly to the others. So many have suspected that she's actually a member of the family, which speaks to the distinction of Spain. Spain is a trilateral community because unlike Europe as a whole, and unlike North Africa and the Middle East, there are really 3 cultures equally participating in Spain: Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And this creates a new power dynamic where no one community is clearly and irrevocably in charge, and creates what some scholars have called la convivencia, or in English, sorry for moving this over, the coexistence. Somewhat exaggerated, rose-colored glasses to be sure, but there's no question that in Spain there were some remarkable figures that achieved some fantastic things, such as, for example, the great Shmuel Hanagid, who was not only a brilliant poet, a commentator on the Talmud, but he was also the Jewish general of a Muslim army for 16 years. I mean, where does that happen, where you have a Rosh Yeshiva who is also chief of staff of the armed forces? It just doesn't happen. It's a very unusual thing. We will definitely explore it in greater detail when we come back in our next meeting, because we have to understand Spain to really appreciate the tragedy of the expulsion. The greatest figure of the era, and this is my last point, is Maimonides, himself a product of the Spanish environment, but a refugee from Muslim radicalism that begins to infiltrate the peninsula. But he represents really the ideal of the Spanish-Jewish combination of tremendous religious authority and learning, and at the same time secular accomplishments. He was a physician who served royalty. He was well published in Arabic, writing on a whole host of medical conditions: anxiety and depression, asthma, diet, and he's well known as a doctor in his time, but he made an incredibly lasting impact, although controversial in his day, for the rest of Jewish history. Okay, with that, I really appreciate your endurance and your attention. I can hang around for a few questions if you like, but I want to say thank you very much. And before I forget, I wish you all a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. You should have an extremely joyous and redemptive Passover, and that we all should enjoy peace and prosperity throughout the world.
Thank you, Dr. Abramson. I want to just point us, if you don't mind, I'm going to first of all say thank you for this wonderful lecture. I do want to ask why in that picture was Maimonides wearing a Havdalah candle in place of a tie?
Yeah, that's a good question. Nobody knows. Obviously, the answer is nobody knows what Maimonides actually looked like. These are highly idealized 19th century depictions. That's my favorite because it's in color, and I also think he sort of looks like a little bit more real, like with the crinkly eyes, than the more standard. And I think this Havdalah candle is supposed to be sort of like channeling Ovadia Yosef, the head chief rabbi of the Sephardim, I think. Good question.
I want to, if you'll hang on for just a couple seconds, I want to point out a couple, if I can put on my screen share, I want to point out just a couple upcoming programs, including your upcoming program. And then I'm going to, we're going to go to just 1 or 2 more questions that were in the screen share. So if I can, I want to just point out that your next program, your next lecture is going to be on May 11th. And we are very much looking forward to that. But before we get that, Rabbi Eliezer Diamond is going to be coming from New York, from technically Teaneck, New Jersey. He's a Gemara and a rabbinics professor at JTS. And he is going to be speaking on Thursday, April 28th on addiction and Judaism. He's an incredible scholar, and he's going to be speaking both from personal experience as well as his scholarship. Incredible human being, and I really want to encourage everyone to come out. That's going to be our first in-person scholar in resident. And on Friday night, he's going to be speaking on the power of gratitude. Please sign up for the Shabbat dinner following the service. And then on Shabbat morning, seeking and granting forgiveness. So please join us for all of that. And we have a couple questions in the chat box that I'd like to finish off with. Maybe you can even combine them. I think they're related to one another, actually. Both are on Islam, if I remember correctly. So one wasn't a lot of Muslim advance due to their decisive victory at Yarmouk, where they destroyed the Byzantine army? And then could you speak a little bit about the success that many Jews had in Islamic lands, politically, economically, and intellectually?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not deeply versed in military history, probably to the level of Mr. Ezekiel. But if I remember correctly, that particular victory was hugely influential for their advance into the Balkans, but does not necessarily represent the equally significant advances that you have to the Far East, going out to Bactria, Pakistan, and northern India, and also to the west across North Africa. And then in the year 711, a year which will live in infamy because we named all those convenience stores after them. I don't know, do they have 7-Eleven in Vancouver?
Yeah.
So 7-Eleven crossing into Spain. But definitely the approach into Europe through the Balkans, I believe, was related to that. The second question is about the success that many Jews had in Islamic lands, politically, economically, intellectually. So it's a huge topic, and we will explore more of it specifically with Spain next time we meet. But, you know, like as I mentioned when I was trying to graph out the conditions that Jews tend to do very well in, a lot of those things were present in many Muslim societies. The recognition that certain trades, like for example, textiles, Jews historically dominated textiles in Islamic lands. And it was just understood that if you wanted to get, you know, a dyed piece of cloth, you would probably deal with a Jewish merchant. And that there was almost like, you know, caste-like boundaries that represented sort of, actually it would be like the diamond industry in New York, right? Lots of Jews in the diamond industry, and just that we sort of populate those areas, and they're almost protected areas for Jewish advancement, where the Jews were engaged in a symbiotic economic relationship, as opposed to in Christian Europe, where they frequently were sort of shunted into certain areas and forbidden to enter other areas. The guilds were very strong and wouldn't let Jews in, and you didn't have that same kind of thing to the same degree in Islamic lands. But we will really focus on Spain next time we talk. Okay, thank you all.